Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. So in today's video I want to focus on mastering Flutter layout. So today I saw this UI on Rebel and I decided to build something similar, and I want to take you guys through how to build this, right? So if you are a beginner and you started learning Flutter, then this project will be good for you so that you know how to lay out widgets in Flutter. So I've downloaded this image here, and then this is where we'll be starting from. So when you have a UI, the first thing to do is to try to break the UI into smaller pieces, right? So if you've started Flutter or you have come across the row and column widgets, then you are at a position where you can break down most of UIs you see, right? Because most of these UIs are just rows and columns which are nested together or work hand in hand with each other. So let's look at how we can tackle this UI in a row and column perspective, right? So I'm first going to work with this, right? And later on I'll break this down. Then we are going to code this in Flutter. So we first realize that we have our back button over here, right? And that tells us that we are dealing with the app bar, right? So if you are new to Flutter, I'll recommend checking out the official documentation, right, to get to know what the app bar is. So app bar is basically the top bar you see here in most apps. So this is going to be an app bar and not anything fancy. After the app bar, you realize that all these portion after the app bar flows downwards, right? So it's just one big column moving vertically downwards. And whenever you have a UI with some parts of it hidden, right? So in this particular case, you could see that this recommended section card could be more than 3, or it could be 20. You don't really know the number. It means this particular UI is something that can scroll. It's a scrollable UI. So you need a widget that will allow your UI to scroll. That's the first thing you have to think of. How do I make this whole content scroll in case they don't fit the available screen height? Because if you don't build it with that in mind, you realize that you are having overflow issues if you get to the bottom of the UI. So we are going to consider all this section as a scrollable widget, and it must some way somehow scroll in a column form. In Flutter, we have the body, which is what comes after the app bar, right? So we can consider this section of our app after the app bar as the body. Now the body takes in a widget, and because we want the whole body of our app to scroll, we have to provide it a scrollable widget. There are lots of scrollable widgets in Flutter, right? So the one you would normally want to use for this case is either a list view, right, or a single child scroll view which has a column as a child, right? And we're going to look at that in the code. So let's assume we have the single child scroll view or the list view. Any of them is going to do, and by default the scroll direction is in the vertical, so you don't have to do any configuration with it. By default, anything within the body is going to scroll when it is within a single child scroll view, a list view, or any scrollable widget. So let's assume now we fix the issue with the scrolling, and then we have our body which has a child which is a scrollable widget. Within this body we are going to have our image, and depending on the assets you have, you may have to create this circular shape and put the image within it, or the image might come within the circular shape depending on which asset you are working with. So if the image already comes with a background which is yellow like this, then you don't have a lot of problem. You just have to put the image there. If you put the image there, it might not be centered. First, the image may be huge, so you have to reduce the width and probably the height. Also, you must center this image within the page. So with that, you can use the center widget to just center everything. After that, the next thing is that you need a space. So realize that we have some space between the image and then the text, the next text. So with that, you can wrap the image in a padding widget and give it a padding bottom, or use a sizer box within your list view or scrollable widget, right? So that will give a space between the image and then your text. Now you know that this is just a normal text widget, and that's how you add text in Flutter. Now this is the UI that may be a little bit complex, so we still have to give some space here. And the next thing we have to do is to have this card, right? So let's assume we want to design this card. How do we start? You first have to know that we have a card widget in Flutter, but if you're not going with a card widget, there is not much difference. You just have to have a container and give it some dimension, right? So a width and a height, so that you can figure out the shape of the card. So for instance, I'm going to give this a height of 250 and a width of double dot infinity, which is going to take the full width of the device. Also, in most cases, you need padding around your scrollable widget so that the widgets within the scrollable widget don't seem to touch the edges of the screen. So you realize in this particular instance, we have space around these sides of the screen. So with that, you can apply a global padding in the scrollable widget, and everything within it won't touch the edges of the screen. So back to this card, what I normally do at first is that I put out the card, right? So I give some fixed dimension. Mostly you'll not be dealing with the height that much. You just want the content of the card to decide the height depending on use case, right? So some other times you may want to have a fixed height for the card, so it doesn't matter how many content it has, it just have to be the same height. Or other times you may want the content of the card to determine the height of the card, right? In this case, you want the card to be filled with the content. In this particular case, both will work. So either giving it a fixed width and height, or allowing the content to decide the width and height of the card. So you just use a card widget. Now within the card widget, you want to have space within the card. So this is the first thing you want to do. Realize that there is space within the card, so that nothing in the card is touching the edges of the card, right? So how do you do that? You just wrap the first child of the card in a padding widget. If you are building UIs, look at the flow of the UI, right? Look at the flow of the UI. How does things flow in this particular card? So you realize that if you decide to go with the row approach in designing the content of the card, assuming we are going to decide we are going to have one row and then maybe another row here, well, how are those rows going to interact with each other? That's technically not possible. So always, our advice always look at UI starting from the top to the bottom. So from the top to the bottom, realize they flow in a vertical way, right? So in a vertical way, we have this particular section, and then we also have this particular section, right? So we have two sections. That's going to be in a column because everything is flowing on the vertical. So starting from the column, within the first part of the column, then we have a row, right? So there is a big card like this. We have a column which has, we have a column like this which has two rows within it. So let's assume row 1 and then row 2, something like this, right? Now within row 1, we are going to have an icon button. So for now, let's assume this is just a normal icon button. So we are going to have one icon button, the next, and then next. And look at how they are spaced around, right? So on the row, we have alignment properties that we can use, and one of them is the main axis alignment. So if you are in a row, the main axis is the horizontal section of the row. If you are in a column, the main axis is the vertical section, and vice versa for cross axis. So if we are in a row, our main axis alignment, how we're going to align things on the horizontal. So we can align them using space between. Space between means on the horizontal side of view, we want to space these items in the row. So when we use space between, what actually is going to happen is this icon button, which is the heart icon button, will move to the far right. This will also move to the far left, and this will be in the middle, because we are aligning them space between on the main axis alignment, which is the horizontal alignment, right? So alignment on the horizontal axis. If we are to align on the cross axis and we are using start and end, then depending on the size of the row, so let's assume the row is as big as this and we are aligning on the cross axis, it means start will push everything to the start of the row, which is this, because cross axis deals in this particular section. So if we are aligning in cross axis alignment, this section, right, this particular section will all move to the top when we use start, or will all move to the bottom when we use end. And when you are beginning, mostly this kind of alignment do confuse, so you have to try them out for a while in order to get familiarized with it. So we are going to have a row, and our alignment is going to be main axis alignment space around. Now the space around is going to leave space here and equal space here, and it's going to share the space left between these two guys, right? So that's what space around will do, and it's not going to be evenly, right? There's going to match space between the left side and the right side compared to the middle section. So that's going to fix our first row. Now in the second row, right, so we can have a row here, or possibly not a row here again, because if this is a row, this too can be a row, but then there is no need putting this guy, which is this progress indicator, in another row, right? So what we could do is just in the column flow, we can have this row, we can have this progress indicator, then we can have this row finally, right? So they are all in a column. Now just this widget will just lie without it being in any row. It's just going to be in the column itself, and this can be a linear progress indicator. So a linear progress indicator just gives this progress indicator in a linear form. This will be a row which is spaced between. Now the first child is going to be a text, the last child is also going to be a text, and they are spaced between. With this layout, you realize that you are going to get your stuff perfectly aligned the way you want it to be. Now after that, you need another space over here, right? And the next thing is going to be your text, which is the recommendation text, and you don't have to align this to the center. So in order to align this to the center, you could use the text alignment property on the text widget. So you align it to the center, but with this particular one, you can just leave it, and by default it goes to the left. The last thing is this particular card before we come to the bottom navigation bar. So these cards looks like a list style, and of course they are list styles, but if you want to have the exact implementation over here, which has this big thumbnail, right, you can't use a list style because list styles can't stretch that much. The leading widgets on a list style can't be as big as this, so you have to have a custom implementation of the list style, just like we did for this card. So again, you can have a card widget, and now this time around we want the whole list style to be pressable, right? So we have to have this inkwell effect. After creating this card widget, you can have an inkwell widget being the immediate child of the card widget. In that case, anything within the inkwell will have this splash effect. This whole section, this time around, we are not going to consider things in a column form, right? Because if they are going to be in a column, then how are they going to look like? Are we going to have this image coming on top and this text? Like, it just doesn't make sense that way to make it a column, because we realize that the whole thing is flowing from left to right. So we are first going to have our image. Then when we get to this section, right, we can assume this section to be a column, because the 5 minutes text over here is not to the right side of this guy, right? It's below it. So these two things, which is these two texts, could just be considered a column. So we can have our image, our text within a column, and then our icon button, which is the play icon button. Now we realize that this play icon button, regardless of the length between the text and then the play icon, is shifted to the far right. So it's always to the far right, even if the text is just a single word. It's supposed to be shifted to the far right. So in that particular instance, we can have a widget called spacer, and then we put it between these items. So we just put the spacer just here in the UI form. Just put the spacer here, and that is going to push these guys, right? So it's going to push everything to the far left and everything to the far right, and that is going to push the icon button to the right side. And after you've designed one instance of this, you could just make it a reusable widget so that it accepts parameters like the image URL, right? If it's an asset image, it accepts the path to the asset, the heading text, the subtext, and on press, right? If you want to perform a particular function when it is being pressed, and then maybe an icon if you want to change the icon. This is a button navigation bar. I think one of the few things you design when you start learning Flutter. So just a basic button navigation bar which has 4 icons, but then the labels are hidden, right? So when they are active or inactive, the labels are still hidden. When you come to this particular section, it's just the same thing. We have a similar UI over here. This is going to be our app bar, and in our app bar we have this drawer button. If you use the drawer widget without putting anything in the app bar, right? So in the scaffold we have a drawer property, and you can pass in a drawer widget. If you use that, that's going to create this leading icon. We call it a leading icon. That is going to create this leading icon for you automatically, but you can create your own leading icon and then use it to open the drawer. So depending on use case. On the far right, we have a property on the app bar called actions, and you can put a circular avatar here. So there is also a widget called circular avatar that will give you this shape, and then you pass in your image, a reference to your image. Just like we discussed previously, there is also a widget. The body section of this should be scrollable. So having a body that can scroll, and then a text or in a column form. So we first have our first text styled differently from the one below, which is the font size is small and then the color is much gray, and then we have this dark text over here which is much bigger. This section of it also feel like something that could be scrolled on the horizontal axis. So instead of scrolling all the page vertically, we want to be able to scroll just this particular portion of it on the horizontal axis. So you could use a sizer box, because in Flutter when you nest 2 scrollable widgets, right, that's going to cause an error. That's going to cause problems in Flutter. So in order to fix that, you could wrap this whole section a sizer box, give it a defined boundary, because the error you are going to get is vertical viewport has been given an unbounded height. So you want to prevent that and give this section of the UI a bounded height by using a sizer box and defining a specific height for it. Or you could use a scrollable widget, and the scrollable widget, which is either a list view or single child scroll view, has a property on it called shrink wrap, right? So use a shrink wrap, set it to true, and that's automatically going to be as big as its children. So that's going to fix the error. Now you can design these cards yourself based on whether they are active, giving them space between. right? So you can loop over this, and if you have a list of categories, you loop over them within the sizer box, which has a single child scroll bar list view, and then you display these texts. Now the same applies to this section, right? So realize we have a column, we have an image within the column, we have a text, and then a subtext, and these are all scrollable, right, within a horizontally scrolling widget. In order to tell Flutter that this scrolls horizontally, you have to change the axis of scroll direction. Now this portion of the UI, we've already talked about it, it's just the same as we have over here. Now let's look at this being built out in code. So I have a portion of this already built out. I didn't get the exact UI, but then I have an implementation of this, and I would like to go through this with you guys. Also, I'll leave the link to the repo in the description so you can go through it yourself. It's just a one page, right? So 146 lines of code to build this whole thing. So let's get into it really quick. We have our app bar, and then we just have our text, which is daily meditation. That's what you could see over here. And as I explained, you need a body, right? And in the body you want a widget that can scroll. So if I collapse this, realize that in the body we just have a list view, and then in the list view, a list view is a widget that can scroll. So that allows me to scroll this whole body in case it overflows. Now we have the padding property also in the list view. That will allow us some padding in the whole body, right? So the whole scrollable widget has some padding, so that you realize that even when I set the width of these cars to double dot infinity or 100%, it still doesn't go beyond the set padding. Now in the children, we have this image which is wrapped in a center widget, right? So that's the first thing we have, and we just an image in my assets, and I've given it a fixed width of 250, and it's in a center widget. Because of that, it is centering it within the list view. Now we have just this sizer box with height 20. That is going to give us a space between the image and then the text. That comes next, and the text is just catching your thoughts, as you can see here, and then I've aligned it to the center. So I'm applying some text style for my team, but then the main deal here is we are trying to style this text and also center it. So if I comment this out and I save, you realize that the text moved to the left section of the screen, and we want everything to be centered. Now when it comes to this card, right, we have first have a sizer box of height 20 for some spacing, and then we have the card. So just like I described, we first have a padding because we want to have padding within the card. We don't want the stuff in the card touching the edges of the card itself. We want to have space around the card, to have space all around of 15, and with the first side of the card in the padding is a column. So we want to align everything in a column because they flow from top to bottom. And the children, we have a row, right? So a row which has the main axis alignment set to space between, and that is going to space out these icon buttons we have, right? So we have 3 icon buttons which contains the icons, right? So we have the shuffle icon, the play icon, and then the heart icon. Now after that, we have a sizer box because we need some space, and the height is 20 to give us some space. And in this particular instance, we are not setting a fixed height for the card. The height of the card is determined by the total height of the children. Now we have the linear progress indicator, which has a value, a fixed value of 0.48 for just the design purpose. It has a color, and then a min height, which is to make it much thicker than the default height, and also it has a background color to create this perception of loading. After that, we have some sizer box for space, and then we have a row which has main axis alignment, space between, and then our 2 text, which is the timer over here. Now after that, so just outside the card, realize that we have this recommendation text. So we first need some space, some small space, and then we have this recommendation text. So if I come here, we have recommendation text, and we need a space here as well. So a size box of height 20 here, and then we have a size box of height 5 here. So that's the size box, and then we have this card. And if you don't know this syntax, so I'm just looping 4 times, and for each time I'm returning this card. It's just because I want to have multiple instances of this card, right? And what this is going to return, I'm just spreading them back in the UI. So you can look at that spread operator for more details if you want to have a look at this syntax. Now, in the card, the first child is an inkwell, and the reason is because I want to have this ink effect when I tap on any part of the card, right? So that's why I have the first child be an inkwell. But in the default inkwell is more like a square, right? So, or a rectangle, instead of it being in this rounded form, because the default card is rounded. So if I comment the border radius part out, you realize the inkwell is going to overflow the card. So I just give it a border radius that's exactly the same as the border radius of this particular card. And within it, we also need some padding, because just like previously, we don't want the items in the card to touch the edges of the card. So we just put another padding here, and inside the padding, this is where we put our widgets, the actual widgets. So we have row, which has the image, a column which has the text, and then a play button. And that's exactly what I have here. We have an image, some space, a column which has the text, focus on the mind, and then I have some minutes over here, right, which is the index plus 4, and then the minutes text. And also I have the spacer. So the spacer widget will just push everything to the left and to the right as well, right? So it's just going to create a big gap over here. The advantage of using the spacer widget is that you don't have to wrap this whole content in another row and then set a main axis alignment of space between on the parent row, right? So if you just use the spacer, that's going to save you that. Also, I have my icon button over here, which is the play button again, and that's all for this. Then we have the bottom navigation bar, which is just a bottom navigation bar with items, right? So this should be the normal bottom navigation bar. If you've worked with Flutter before, just have a bottom navigation bar widget, and I've set the type to fixed. I've also hidden the labels, so they are all hidden, right? So both when they are active and inactive, we have the labels hidden. And then we have the items, which is the individual items on the bottom navigation bar. Yeah, so this is how you approach a UI like this, and this is how you break down UIs, right, in Flutter. If you like this video, leave a like, and I'll see you in the next one.